Bonjour, je m'appelle Dominique Coulon,
Hello,
je
my
suis
name is
architecte.
Dominique Coulon.
Je
I'm
suis
an
né en France
architect. I
en
was born in France
1961
in
dans le
1961
Jura.
in the Jura region.
Le Jura, c'est
The
la
Jura is a
région
region that is close
qui est
to
proche
Switzerland,
de la Suisse.
and
Et en
it's
fait,
in
c'est
fact
plus
more of a
un
landscape
paysage
than a place
qu'un
where there are
site où on
cities.
trouve des villes.
So
Donc,
I was
moi,
born in the
je suis né à la
countryside,
campagne. Voilà, et
and the notion of
la
landscape,
notion de
I
paysage,
think
je pense
I'm
que
attached to it,
j'y suis attaché,
even
même
if I
si
like the
j'aime
cities very
beaucoup les
much.
villes. Là, je lance, non? Ah oui, d'accord.
Now I
Alors
live
maintenant,
in
j'habite
Strasbourg
Strasbourg et
and I am a
je suis
teacher at the
professeur
Strasbourg
à
School
l'école
of
d'architecture de Strasbourg.
Architecture.
Euh,
My
alors mon
career
parcours
path
est
is finally
finalement
quite
assez classique,
classical,
mais je crois que
but
ce
I think
qui
that what
caractérise mon
defines my
enfance,
childhood is that
c'est
I
que
was
je me suis
very
beaucoup
bored. In
ennuyé en
fact,
fait
when I
quand
was
j'étais
a
enfant,
child,
parce que
I
j'étais à
was
la
in the
campagne.
country.
Et donc,
I used to
je
ride a
faisais de la
moped
mobilette et
and
pas
not much more, in
grand-chose de
fact.
plus, en fait. Et
So
donc,
I have the
j'ai le souvenir
memory of great
de grandes
periods
périodes
when I was
où
bored.
je m'ennuyais. Voilà. Et
I
j'ai pas
wouldn't
envie de
say
dire
that
que
my
l'éducation
vocation
d'architecte
as an
est
architect
devenue à ce
became at that
moment-là.
time.
Je sais pas
I don't
exactement
know
d'ailleurs, parce
exactly,
que
because
j'ai
I
presque envie
will
de dire que
say that
j'étais un
I
peu le
was a
mauvais
sort of a
élève.
bad
J'avais un peu du
student.
mal
I had a bit
à
of
rentrer en fait
trouble getting
dans un
into a
cadre.
framework. I
Euh,
had trouble with
J'avais
the
du mal avec
teachers.
les
I really
professeurs.
had
Il fallait vraiment
to like them
que je
to
les aime bien
want to
pour avoir envie
work.
de travailler.
And if there
Et
wasn't
s'il n'y
this
avait pas
strong
cette
relationship,
relation
I didn't work
forte,
much.
et ben en fait, je travaillais peu. Voilà. Et donc,
Then I started
j'ai
my
commencé mes
studies
études à
in
Strasbourg.
Strasbourg.
Voilà. Et Strasbourg,
Strasbourg has a
c'est
very
une très belle
beautiful
cathédrale que vous
cathedral
voyez ici.
that you can see here.
Et puis,
And this
ça,
is
c'est un
a
paysage
landscape
aussi.
too.
Voilà. C'est-à-dire,
That is to say,
c'est
it's
les deux à
both
la
at the
fois.
same
Voilà.
time,
Pour moi,
which means
l'architecture,
that for me,
elle est
architecture
nécessairement
is
rattachée
necessarily
à un
connected
site,
to a
à un
site,
paysage.
to a landscape.
Et puis,
And I
j'ai
also
aussi
worked
travaillé avec
with a
un
landscape
paysagiste pendant quelque
architect for
temps.
some time,
Ça m'a
and that
apporté
brought me this
cette
relationship,
relation, en fait,
which
qui me
seems
semble
important
importante
to
entre
me, between
architecture et
architecture
paysage,
and
et puis
landscape, and
territoire
also
aussi.
territory. It was
Ça, c'est Edgar
Edgar
Morin, un
Morin,
philosophe
a
célèbre,
famous
qui
philosopher
justement
who reflected
réfléchit
on
sur la
complex
pensée
thought,
complexe.
and
Et peut-être c'est ça
perhaps that's what
qui
interests me.
m'intéresse,
It's
c'est finalement
the
la
complexity
complexité
of
du
reality.
réel. Et quand on est
And when you are an
architecte,
architect, you are
on est
confronted with
confronté à
multiple situations,
comment dire, des situations multiples, des
political,
situations politiques,
geographical,
géographiques,
climatic, and many
climatiques,
other situations,
et bien d'autres encore,
economic as
économiques
well.
aussi.
And for me,
Et pour moi, ça, c'est
that is in the
dans la
making of the
fabrication du
project.
projet, euh,
It's a
c'est un élément
dynamic
dynamique.
element.
C'est un élément dynamique
And
et j'ai
this
envie de dire
dynamic element,
que cette
I
dynamique, je
discovered
l'ai
it in
découvert en
fact
fait
during my
dans
philosophy
mes cours de
classes.
philosophie.
I had
J'avais
a
un
teacher whom
professeur
I
que
liked
j'aimais
very
beaucoup
much, who
qui a
taught
enseigné à la
at the
Sorbonne ensuite
Sorbonne
à
in
Paris.
Paris afterwards.
Et en fait,
And in fact,
ce que je
what
trouve
I find interesting
intéressant
in
dans la philosophie,
philosophy
c'est
is
cette
this
capacité
ability to
à
finally
décrypter le réel,
decipher reality,
jamais le prendre tel
never
quel,
taking it
et
as it
puis
is, and
finalement
finally
dénouer
striping away
la
the
complexité.
complexity.
Et donc,
And so I will
je
say
dirais
that
que
in
dans
my
mon
work
travail,
now, what
maintenant, ce qui
interests
m'intéresse,
me more is to
c'est
play with
justement
this
jouer avec cette
complexity.
complexité, c'est-à-dire
This
cette
complexity for me
complexité, pour moi, elle
is
est dynamique.
dynamic
Dans
in
le
the
projet, là, vous
project.
avez une,
Here you have a
une grille de
chart by
Borromini,
Borromini,
et
and what
ce
is
qui est,
impressive
comment dire,
in its
impressionnant, je
architecture
trouve,
is that
dans son architecture, c'est souvent,
it is
elle est dans
often
des
placed
situations
in complex
complexes. Le
situations.
contexte
The
n'est pas
context is
simple.
not
Et
simple,
puis, en fait,
and there's a
il y a une
dynamic that
dynamique
is generated
qui
by
se
the
génère
context.
avec le contexte.
And so
Et donc,
it is these
c'est
notions
ces
that I
notions-là
like to integrate
que
into
j'aime
my
bien intégrer, en
projects.
fait, dans projet.
And
Voilà. Et
I
puis,
will say that
je dirais que
there are also
évidemment, il y
things
a aussi
that are
des choses
close to my
qui
heart.
me sont, qui me
It's the
tiennent à
work
cœur. C'est
on
le travail sur la
light.
lumière.
It's
C'est
also
aussi le travail
the work on the
sur le
course
parcours
that one can
qu'on
have
peut
in a building,
avoir dans un
a
bâtiment,
kind
une
of
sorte
spatial
de
generosity
générosité
that
spatiale
I always
que
try
je
to
cherche
put
toujours
in
à
place
mettre en
so
place
that in the end
pour
you
que
can be
finalement on
carried
puisse, dans
away
un projet,
by
être
the space
emporté en fait
in a project.
par l'espace.
And then
Et
there
puis,
is also color.
il y a aussi
A
la
color which
couleur
is
qui est
often
souvent présente
present in
dans
my
mon
architecture
architecture et qui est là
and
aussi
which is
pour,
also
je
there to
dirais, marquer en
mark
fait.
and
Marquer
perhaps
et puis
also to
peut-être un peu déstabiliser
destabilize the
aussi
space and the people who walk
l'espace
through it.
et les personnes qui le parcourent.
So
Donc finalement, le
finally,
rapport
there's
entre
a
la végétation
relationship
et la
between
couleur, c'est des
vegetation
choses
and color.
qui me
These are
semblent
things that
importantes.
are important to me.
Et puis ensuite,
And
ce que
I
j'aime bien
also
aussi,
like
c'est
to
travailler
work on
sur
a
une certaine
certain
intériorité. C'est-à-dire qu'un
interiority.
bâtiment,
That is to say that a
pour moi, enfin
building, for
les
me, the
architectures
two
qu'on dessine,
architectures that we draw
elles
contain
contiennent quelque
something.
chose, c'est-à-dire
That's to say that there is
souvent
often a
une
sort
sorte
of
de
two
surprise qui
surprises
existe
that
entre, je dirais,
exist
la
between the
silhouette du bâtiment et ce
silhouette
qu'on y
of the
découvre.
building and what
C'est un
we discovered
architecte,
there.
Luca
It was an
Merlini, qui disait
architect,
que
Lucas Merlini, who
certains
said
de
that
nos bâtiments,
some
ils
of our
ressemblent à
buildings look
des
like
sortes de rochers
spells of
soulevés.
raised rocks. And this is
Et d'ailleurs,
something that
c'est
we
quelque chose
develop
qu'on
in our
développe là dans
latest
notre
monograph that will
dernière
be
monographie
published by
qui va
ACTAR.
être publiée chez
There
ACTAR.
are
Il y a des
interviews,
entretiens
and I
justement.
am
Et
developing
donc,
this
je
notion.
développe cette notion.
So
Voilà. Et donc,
there are
j'ai envie de dire, il y
several
a plusieurs
situations in
situations dans
architecture
l'architecture
that interest me.
qui m'intéressent.
Either
Soit
the
le
context,
contexte,
it is
il est
very
très
strong,
fort. Et puis,
and then at
à
that
ce
moment,
moment-là, c'est
it is
presque le bâtiment
almost the
qui se
building
fit
that adapts to the
au contexte.
context.
Ou alors,
Or
si le
if the
contexte est,
context is
je dirais,
maybe
une neutralité
hilariously neutral,
désopilante,
at that
et à ce
moment
moment-là,
it is the
c'est le
building that
bâtiment qui
creates
fabrique
its own
ce
context.
contexte. Donc,
So in these
dans ces
situations,
situations-là,
there is
j'ai
a
une
stronger
intériorité qui est plus
interiority.
forte. Parce qu'en fait, ce qui m'intéresse, c'est plus de fabriquer
In
une
fact,
sorte
what
d'univers.
interests me is to create a
L'univers
kind
dans
of
lequel finalement
universe, a
on est coupé du
universe
monde.
in which
C'est-à-dire,
you are isolated from the
j'aime bien
world.
proposer en fait des
I
lieux
like to
où
propose places
il y a
where
une
there's
sorte
a
de
kind of
coupure
rupture in space.
dans
And
l'espace en
in
fait,
fact, we
où on se
finally
serait
get out of the
de réduire
city to have
pour
something
avoir
else.
autre chose. Et
And
puis
then
il y
there
a
is
aussi quelque
also
chose dans lequel je suis
something that I am
attaché,
attached to, and
c'est
it's
l'enseignement.
teaching.
Là vous
In my
avez
slide, you
sous
can see
les yeux
some
des
mock-up
maquettes en
made
fait,
by students.
d'étudiants. Je trouve que
Except
l'enseignement,
that teaching is,
la
in any
façon
case, the
dont
way I
j'essaie de
try
le
to
dispenser,
give, or maybe
c'est peut-être aussi avec le souvenir
because of the
que j'ai eu
memories I had of my
de mon
boredom
ennui, en
when I
fait,
was a child,
d'avoir
and the
certains
memories of
cours,
certain
certains
courses,
professeurs.
certain teachers.
Et en fait,
And in fact, what
ce qui
interests
m'intéresse,
me is
c'est
to try
d'essayer
to
de
convey
transmettre
a
une
kind
sorte
of
de
joy,
joie
to seek
de chercher, en fait,
to take
dans un projet,
risks in a
de
project.
prendre des risques.
That's
Ça,
something that I like.
c'est quelque chose que j'aime
I like it.
bien. Et
This summer I saw an exhibition of David Hockney, and at one point he says that you mustn't be afraid to look ridiculous. And maybe that's it too. At a given moment, when you make something, when you draw, when you think, in fact, you finally manage to detach yourself from references, from what you know how to do. So it's like getting off the ground. And I find that here, complex thinking, complexity is a good help, because it also allows for debate, it allows for exchange. And then that's what defines my teaching, I think. It is something that I also part of, that it's also part of, and in fact, it's it's also linked to my production, in fact. I have the impression that I will be very unhappy if I couldn't teach, and I will even more unhappy if I couldn't draw projects. For example, here you can see a drawing by Álvaro Sisa for the Venice Biennale. It's a small layout, and I think it's a superb plan, because you get the impression that in the end there is someone looking at you, yet it's only a plan. I think it's very beautiful, and I believe very much in the final strength of the drawing of the plan and of the cut, obviously. And I think that there are resonances, in fact, that are established in the making of the plans. Here you see some works made by students. You can try to look at them, and then there is this magic sometimes where you can feel the pleasure that exists in the making of the project. And finally, the students are often very motivated, and that is very pleasant. What I like about architecture is the fact that in the end things change enormously, contrary to what some people might say. And in the end, there are obviously permanent elements, but there are also devices that move around, and perhaps that's what interests me. What interests me is to play with them. And the architecture is a game. There are parameters, there are questions, and there you go, it all makes something. I often tell my students what will be nice is that their projects looks like nothing. So often it makes them laugh, but at the same time, when I say that, it's also a way to tell them that it's up to them to invent what they want to do. It's up to them to find new situations and postures that are radical or soft or maybe pleasant. So it's up to them to invent all, and finally the project is a place where we say something, where we really have a posture. That is to say that the architect, for me, is not someone who is neutral or someone who feels a kind of requirement, but it's someone who gets involved and tries to understand, and at the same time, someone who finally transforms things in relation to what he has understood. And there is obviously a generosity that normally has to settle into a project, because that's what it's all about. The objective is to create places that we don't forget, places in which we will meet, we will exchange, we will remember them. That's why I like to go to the cities, for example. I often like to go to the cities on holiday because they have their own history. They are artificial places. So this kind of production is very exciting. Finally, with age, maybe, I am less attracted to landscapes and more to cities. Cities tell stories, there are beautiful things, there are flaws. All of that's where we gather. In fact, that's what I wanted to tell you. Maybe I could also talk to you about project methods, because what I like is working with mockups. Mockups aren't just models, just scale models. They are a means And when
quand on
we
la
build
fabrique, ou en
them,
tout cas quand on
and
la
when we
regarde,
look at them,
quand on la
when
démonte,
we take it
quand on la
apart, and
remonte,
when we put it back
il y
together,
a
there are
des
suggestions
suggestions
about the
dans la matière
material
de
of
la
the
maquette
mocap
qui font
that
que
make
la
the making
fabrication
of
du
the
projet, elle est
project
aussi
also
autour de ça.
around it.
C'est-à-dire, ça nous permet,
That is to
euh,
say that it
j'ai
allows
l'impression que c'est
us,
un outil
and I have the impression that it is a
qu'on
tool
peut
that we
toucher, en
can
fait. C'est ça
touch.
qui est intéressant,
That's
c'est que
what's interesting. We
on peut
can take the
l'apprendre,
mocap, we
on peut
can
l'appréhender.
apprehend it.
Et donc,
And so my students
mes
often,
étudiants,
without
souvent,
my asking,
sans que je leur
and they
demande,
often make
ils
lots
fabriquent
of
souvent beaucoup de
mockups.
maquettes. Voilà. Et
And then I
puis
also
ensuite,
tell them how
je
this
leur dis
mockup
aussi
can be made.
comment peut être
That
faite
is to
cette
say,
maquette,
the
c'est-à-dire
idea
l'idée,
is
c'est pas
not
de
to
figer une
freeze a
situation, mais
situation,
justement, c'est
but on the contrary.
et souvent
Often the
les
most
plus belles
beautiful
maquettes, c'est les
mockups
maquettes
are the
d'études, c'est
study
celles qui sont
mockups, which are a
un peu
little
abîmées,
bit damaged,
transformées.
transformed,
Voilà,
and that's what I find
c'est ça
interesting.
que je
And
trouve
obviously,
intéressant. Et
when we look at them,
évidemment, quand on
we
les
have
regarde,
a
on a
kind of
une sorte
capacity
de
to apprehend the
capacité à
scale
appréhender
of the
justement
future
l'échelle
building or the
du
future
futur bâtiment
project.
ou du projet. Et puis,
And this
cet
object
objet
that we
qu'on a
have
face à
in
nous,
front of us,
nous
it
interpelle.
challenges us.
Donc
So
voilà,
that's
donc la méthode,
maybe
c'est
the
peut-être ça, c'est
method.
peut-être aussi
Maybe it's
l'idée
also the
que
idea that
en dessinant un
when we
projet,
draw
moi
projects,
j'aime bien que
I like the idea
qu'il y ait une
that there's a
certaine
certain
flottance, c'est-à-dire
floating, that is
les
to
choses
say,
flottent,
things
c'est-à-dire que
float.
finalement l'idée,
At the end, the
elle n'est
idea
pas
is not totally posed
totalement
from the
posée
start. It
dès le
is
départ,
dynamic. And I
j'aime
like the
bien le
blur.
flou en fait.
In fact, I like
J'aime bien
this
ce moment en
moment.
fait
In fact, the
où
whole
le projet
project is floating,
il est
and
flottant.
maybe
Voilà, il est
it's the
flottant,
fact
c'est-à-dire que
that I have a literary
peut-être que
background
c'est,
that
je
makes me
dirais,
comfortable with that.
le fait que j'ai une formation littéraire qui me fait, qui fait que
That's
je suis à l'aise en fait avec ça.
to say
C'est-à-dire que
that I don't need to
j'ai pas
be
besoin d'être
reassured about
rassuré
this
comme ça
project, which is in the
sur ce
making
projet qui est en
stage.
fabrication. Donc
At the
finalement,
end,
j'ai presque envie
when
de dire
things
quand ça se
don't
passe
go well,
pas très
when
bien,
we don't find the
on trouve
solution,
pas,
when there are
je dirais, des
things
solutions,
that are done badly
il y a
and
des
the
choses qui
project
sont,
is
je
clumsy,
dirais, encore mal faites, maladroites.
I'm not worried, in
Je suis
fact.
pas inquiet en fait. Pour moi,
For me,
c'est des
these
moments,
are
c'est
floating
des moments
moments,
flottants, c'est
and
des
they
moments
are
aussi
also
de
moments of
plaisir parce que là,
pleasure because
c'est encore
there are still
des moments
moments
où
where there are
il y a des
possibilities.
possibles en fait.
And the
Les possibles,
possibilities
c'est-à-dire le projet
means that
se développer.
the project can
De
develop in
plusieurs
several
façons.
ways.
Donc,
So
c'est ça,
that's
ce système
what
ouvert en fait
this
qui fait
open
que
system does, in my opinion. And that's what I like about the
ça que j'aime,
projects
quoi,
making.
dans la fabrication du projet, quoi. Et
And
donc, j'ai
I
presque
would
envie
like
de
to
dire,
say
j'ai
that I know
un
an
ingénieur
engineer who I think
qui, je
has
crois, a
understood
bien
this
compris ça,
very well.
c'est-à-dire que jamais
He
il a
never
fait,
lectured
il a
me
fait la
about the
morale sur la structure
structure,
en me disant ah
or
non, c'est
telling me
compliqué,
that something's
pourquoi c'est comme
complicated, or
ça,
asking
et
why
ça
it is
serait
like
tellement
that, or saying that it
plus
would be
intéressant
much
si
more
c'était plus simple.
interesting if it was
J'ai jamais eu ça de sa
simpler.
part, et ça c'est
I've never
intéressant
had
parce que
that from him,
justement,
and it's interesting. His
il
name is
s'appelle
Philippe
Philippe
Clement,
Clément.
and he's in fact
Il s'intéresse
interested,
en
and
fait,
he
il
tries
essaie de
to get
rentrer
into
dans
the
la
logic of the
logique
project,
du projet,
and
et
then
puis
finally he's attached
finalement
to
il est
the
attaché au
questioning
questionnement, c'est-à-dire qu'est-ce qu'on
and
cherche à
to
faire,
what we are trying
voilà.
to do.
Et
As a
donc
result, in
du
the
coup
end,
finalement la structure
and the
elle
structure
accompagne
accompanies this
l'espace,
space, and it's quite
et c'est assez
surprising
étonnant parce que
because
souvent on a
often we have the
des espaces
spaces where the
je
structure
dirais où la
is
structure
almost
est presque
invisible,
invisible. Et
and
donc
therefore it's
c'est assez
interesting
intéressant parce
because
que
we don't
on
really
ne
know
sait pas
how
trop
it
comment
fits,
entre guillemets ça tient.
to say it some way. And
Et
so I
donc là
could
je
say that
dirais que
in some cases,
dans
I
certains
think,
cas,
for
comme par
example,
exemple on a fait
we
un
have
théâtre,
made a
on a
theater
ce
and we
foyer
had this
où
foyer where we have found a whole series of obliques that unfold in the space. And it is true that in the end we have a rather difficult understanding of the space. That is to say that there are rather few reference points, and in fact it is a path that carries you away. There is this path that carries you away, and there's the pleasure of the path and the pleasure of emptiness, the pleasure of apprehending emptiness. And these are moments that I like to do because they are often difficult to draw. And therefore, we are obliged to work on this tool of the mocap. There is also work made on the plans. In general, I consider that the plans must have a certain balance. A balance that makes certain lines or certain walls resonate with others. And so things are put in place as they go along. And so this is a kind of trial and error. That is to say that we don't follow any particular rules. It is more of a plastic relationship, a kind of plastic acoustics, as Le Corbusier said, where in fact we look at the plan and we see these balances that exist, these elements that resonate in tension, and often if it exists in the plan, it also exists in space. So here's what I could say about it and what I am actually interested in architecture. Finally, I came here a little bit by chance, and then I discovered architectural studies, and I was totally delighted. I found myself liking almost all of the disciplines, whereas before I often liked only one. It was quite strange, it was enriching, it was a real pleasure to study. So I recommend it to those who don't know what to do. I recommend architectural studies because, well, it's often said, but I think it's an opening. It gives you the ability to grasp reality, and I think that you can do everything with an architect diploma, including architecture, of course. But I have the impression that we have a real chance. So maybe that's it.
So, Dominique, thank you for your talk. It was very nice to have the opportunity to get to know you. My first question would be so before opting to study architecture, you consider literature and philosophy, is that right? What made you pick architecture?
Pourquoi est-ce que j'ai choisi l'architecture? Ouais. En fait, après le bac, en fait, j'hésitais un peu.
After graduating from high school, I hesitated a little. I liked philosophy a lot. It was something that tempted me, and then I had admiration for a philosophy teacher, someone I respected a lot, and I spoke to him, and he told me that philosophy was kind of special. Finally, he advised me to choose architecture. Maybe I liked philosophy, but I wasn't good enough for it. I don't know. But in any case, he told me that architecture was interesting too, and so I chose to become an architect. That helped me a lot. In fact, I had the impression that the philosophical approach was actually found in the way of approaching architecture. That is to say that we are always in a situation where we are obliged to question things, to question them, but also to re-question them and to contest them. And this has become a bit of an obsession for me. Nothing is taken for granted, and so in the making of the project I always try to tell myself, but why is it like that, and why couldn't it be otherwise? And so I have the impression that this is a philosophical approach, that is to say, things are not there in a definitive way, but they move. And in fact, I will say that architecture moves a lot, not buildings, but the methods that projects are developed, it is constantly questioned. And in any case, I try to question it in the framework of my teaching. We think how we do things and why we do things, and that's what gives meaning to it. It seems important to me, and that's why in the end there are certain projects that are perhaps not very rational, because I don't have this culture of maths, or finally the projects shouldn't be a kind of problem which demand an exact solution. I'm quite comfortable with the idea that the project is not totally right. That's it, that the project is either incomplete, or in any case the project questions things. There's this strangeness that makes it like that. But it is not a problem of maths. It's something that is more complex than that.
And the question would be, which architects do you consider to be your role model, if you have a role model?
Oui, vous nous avez compris?
Oui.
Vous utilisez la couleur, est-ce que vous avez un modèle?
Alors,
un architecte modèle, après ça peut vous pouvez peut-être parler d'artiste, je sais pas.
Ouais, est-ce que j'ai un architecte modèle? Alors, j'ai vu récemment les
I
bâtiments
recently
de Barragan.
saw the buildings by Barragan, and I was quite impressed by his architecture.
Finalement, je le connaissais assez
But
peu.
I didn't know him very well.
Alors, est-ce que j'ai un modèle d'architecte? Je pense que pour la couleur.
Regarding color,
finalement, la couleur, elle est.
In the end, apart from Barragan, the color is not used very much.
Alors, tous les bâtiments qu'on fait
So
ne sont
not
pas en
all the
couleur.
buildings we do are in color. So
couleur,
color
elle vient,
comes from the context.
J'ai presque envie de dire, elle vient du contexte.
We will say that it comes from the context. For me,
la couleur,
color comes when we are in an emergency situation. That is, if, for example, we are in a park, we are in a beautiful landscape, perhaps color is not useful. What I notice is that I think of the farm building we did in a country landscape, and we made it in green because there we wanted the architecture to finally disappear. And inside there was kind of a hospital that we did in red. Red is quite unusual because people often say that you need soothing soft colors in hospitals, and I don't think so. In any case, we have never received any reproach for betraying it with red. And why?
J'ai l'impression que
Because
à un
I
moment
have the
donné, la
impression
couleur,
that at a
elle
given moment,
s'impose,
color
c'est-à-dire
imposes
elle
itself.
se met
That is
comme
to
une
say
sorte
that it is
d'évidence,
a
comme
kind
ça.
of
Et
evidence.
puis,
And
voilà.
that's it.
Donc,
Pas de modèle.
The last question is, what advantages do you have being based in Strasbourg?
l'avantage,
Perhaps
c'est peut-être
the advantage is
qualité
the
de la
quality
ville.
of the
La
city.
ville qui est à
The
la
city
fois
that it's
finalement pas
both
si grande
not
que
so
ça,
big
et
and
puis
then
un peu à
a
côté,
little
un
bit
peu à
on the
côté.
side.
Et j'ai envie de dire,
I could say
la
that the
difficulté
problem in
en France, c'est
France
que tout le monde
is that
pense qu'il faut
everyone thinks
habiter à
that you
Paris.
have to live in
Voilà,
Paris.
pour être quelqu'un
To be
d'important,
someone
il faut être à
important,
Paris.
you must be in
Et
Paris.
moi, je crois que
And I think that
parfois, quand on
sometimes
est à
when you are
côté ou à
nearby or
distance,
at a certain
c'est aussi
distance, it's
intéressant.
also
Voilà.
interesting.
Et j'ai l'impression que
What
ce
I
que
like
j'aime
in
bien,
this
c'est
city
dans cette ville
is maybe that it
finalement
is
proche de la
close to
Suisse, de
Switzerland,
l'Allemagne, de la
Germany,
Belgique,
Belgium,
on
and
a le
that
sentiment
you
d'être
probably feel more
probablement plus
European
européen,
in
en
any
tout cas
case.
plus au cœur de
And you
l'Europe.
feel more at the
Et
heart of
peut-être
Europe,
moins français,
and
moins
perhaps
français,
less
un peu
French,
plus
and a little
ouvert
bit more
vers
open to
l'étranger, un peu.
foreign countries.
Voilà.
That sounds,
Donc,
sounds good. That sounds great.
voilà.
Thank you, Dominique. Thank you for the talk. Thank you for the interview. Thank you for your time.